That first Easter morning, it was dark. There was intense grief. The images of their friend Jesus on the cross was fresh in their minds. Things were not the same anymore. Things were not what they knew them to be. And in the midst of all of that, Mary crept out in the dark, off to the tomb to embalm Jesus' body, as was the custom. But to her surprise, Jesus' body wasn't there. So not only had her friend Jesus died, but now his body was missing. And she stood there, weeping. And next we hear that before her was Jesus. But she didn't recognize him until he spoke her name. Then she recognized him, and she ran off to shout the good news to the others. Now, we have no idea what happened that very first Easter morning. We have no idea if it went down just like we heard in the Gospel of John, which was written down about 100 years after Jesus' resurrection. But we know the emotions that Mary was experiencing. We know the emotion that we go through when we are grieving, and we just sort of go through the motions of doing something, doing anything when the grief is so intense. We know those raw emotions of grief. We know what it's like to weep. We know what it's like to be filled with fear and uncertainty. And we can feel those things deep in our souls along with Mary, with the other disciples. And we can also feel the wonderment, the excitement of seeing Jesus, of encountering Jesus. We know that sense of doubt when she doesn't quite recognize him. We can know what it's like to have a stranger invade our grief space. And we can hear that delight and that joy in seeing the one she was missing most of all, in seeing Jesus. And it leads me to wonder, what experiences have brought us such profound joy that we can't help but run and tell somebody about it? Now maybe it's upon seeing a rainbow across the sky. I know whenever I see a rainbow, I shout out to whoever's nearby, "You've got to come quick, come see this rainbow." Or maybe it's experiencing a child, experiencing the joy of bubbles, where they can't help but kind of dance around and try to catch them. Or the face of a loved one on Zoom. Joy has this capacity to transform our focus on grief. It has the capacity to help us to remember that there is life, that life always comes. Suffering is not the end of our story. We may know intense grief. We may struggle. We may have grief that lingers on and on for far longer than we want. But our God stirs within and among us to transform us, to bring life to us. Perhaps not in the form of a loved one coming alive again, but in transformation that happens to us and among us. It might not be in the ways we expect it, but God walks with us through it all. God walks with us through our grief until we dance with joy once again. We are people who live expectantly. We know that suffering is not the end of Jesus' story, and suffering is not the end of our story. Friends, we are Easter people. We are Mary, running and bursting forth. We have seen our living God in and among us. We are people that can be transformed, as in the transformation of an ugly metal cross into a beautiful, succulent display. Now, succulence will live on in our cross until we gather back together in person. Whenever that is, we will bring flowers and transform our living cross into a flowering cross. Friends, for the gift of transformation that comes from our God, we can shout Alleluia. For the gift of God's grace in and among us, we can shout Alleluia. For the gift of life, we can shout Alleluia. Thanks be to God.